Shalom. I am Howard Blas. I'm coming to you from New Haven, Connecticut. I'm a social worker. I'm a special education teacher, a bar mitzvah teacher, specializing in working with people with all kinds of different disabilities. And I'm the director of the National Ramah Tikva Network. So at Camp Ramah, we have proudly been including campers with a wide range of disabilities since 1970. I'll talk about that a little bit later. I'm also a writer for such publications as the Jerusalem Post, JNS, which is the Jewish News Syndicate, and Chabad.org. I've been honored to present at many Limud conferences, Toronto, Mexico City, and other places. And I am honored to have been a contributor for this year's Global Day of Jewish Learning. The theme for this year is the bonds between us, and my chapter is entitled Sacred Inclusivity. So as we all know, the acronym DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, have come into use quite a lot recently. It is beyond the scope of this presentation to discuss this entire topic, but I would like to spend a few minutes discussing the topic of inclusion. I would like to suggest that the Jewish tradition is rich in working to be inclusive. At the same time, in speaking with people with disabilities, it reveals that we're not quite completely there yet. So in the next 15 or 20 minutes or so, I'd like to explore several sources from our tradition, which mostly shine a favorable light on people with differences. I'd like to share the story of Judy Heumann and some other Jewish people and their perspectives on how we're doing around inclusion. I would like to share an interesting Talmudic text which provides a workaround to a very difficult Torah source that seems to be excluding people. And finally, I want to share the really beautiful story of what I would consider an intentional, sacred, inclusive community. So we're taught at the beginning of Genesis that God created man in God's image. So already at the outset, each person is valued. We are instructed throughout the Torah on how to treat the other. We are not to insult the deaf. We are not to put a stumbling block before the blind. And there are so many laws about how to treat the widow and the orphan and others. We are taught that we were all present at Sinai. What a beautiful image. 600,000 men, up to 2 million people, including men, women, and children, all at Mount Sinai. And as proof, I think, that we are all valued, we are taught near the end of the Torah in Parshat Nitzavim, the portion of Nitzavim, when Moses is giving a series of farewell speeches, it says, Atem, you plural, are all standing today, all of you before the Lord your God, your tribal heads, your elders, your officials, all the men of Israel, your children, your wives, even the stranger within your camp, from woodchopper to water drawer. Everybody was included. And we are taught that God's home is open to all. Ki veti beit tefillah yikarei lechol ha'amim. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all people. So I'd like to raise a question to think about. How do we think we are doing in implementing this biblical idea, or maybe biblical ideal? I would like to suggest that the Bible is clear what should be. I am not sure that all people with disabilities always feel that welcomed. Some people with disabilities have described as feeling like guests or outsiders. Sometimes they feel like people are doing them a favor by having a ramp, by constructing a ramp, by providing a Braille Siddur or a sign language interpreter. Many of you have probably seen the wonderful recent movie called Crip Camp, featuring one of my personal heroes, Judy Heumann, spelled Heumann, which will let you understand why the title of her book is so interesting. She's a well-known disability rights activist. The movie is about her experience and those of other people with disabilities in the early 1970s at an overnight summer camp. And she's the author of a book called Being Human, an unrepentant memoir of a disabilities rights activist. And her illustrious career includes serving in various capacities in the Clinton administration, in Office of Special Education, World Bank's advisor on disability and development. She's probably best known as taking on the New York City school system when she was initially denied the right to teach because she was a wheelchair user. She also led a 28-day sit-in on Madison Avenue in New York that resulted in the signing of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, et cetera, et cetera. And she speaks about her involvement in the Jewish community. She's proudly Jewish. She's active in her synagogue, Adas Israel in Washington, D.C. And Judy sees disabled individuals participating more in synagogues. She especially liked the fact that the pandemic allowed for more access to people on Zoom. Yet in a recent interview in the foreword, she said, when you really get to a more meaningful discussion, when you get into a more meaningful discussion, people with disabilities, still don't feel a part of the community because of things that people say to them or don't say to them or include or don't include. When she was asked, what do people want to see the Jewish community be doing better for disability awareness and inclusion beyond pandemic specific issues, she said, I think I want to no longer be called, I don't want it to be called awareness and inclusion. She may have been referring to the month that the Jewish community has, which is called JDAME, Jewish Disability Awareness, Inclusion, and Acceptance Month. We don't say that for LGBTQ community or for people of color community. For those communities, I think we've recognized that we're having to deal with issues of discrimination and inclusion, learning about what the barriers are, what our feelings are, how we treat people. I think that's very important. And I don't think that Judy is alone. It's very important when you talk about disabilities, there's an important concept called nothing about us without us. You must talk to people with disabilities before making policy for the disabilities community. There are definitely schools that still don't have access to the BIMA. There are people who are so-called included in Jewish youth groups and Jewish schools, but the question is whether those students actually develop true friendships. I think I'd like to suggest a couple of questions based on Judy's comments. What do you think Judy means when she says that people with disabilities don't feel part of the community? So think about what she's referring to. She points out the value of naming discrimination. What are some ways that people with disabilities face discrimination in Jewish settings? And what are some things that synagogues and other Jewish institutions can do to make people with disabilities and all people feel more included? I want to shift gears and talk to you a little bit about some of my bar mitzvah teaching work these past 30 years, preparing people with disabilities for bar and bat mitzvah. And the work has been wonderful. It's included people with learning disabilities, people who are autistic, have Down syndrome, people who use augmented communication devices in various settings, in synagogues, outside of synagogues, Mondays, Thursdays, Rosh Chodesh. I think we're at a good place where these days, nobody is saying, sorry, we don't do disabilities bar and bat mitzvahs. This may in part be thanks to a beautiful film that was made by my friend and colleague, Alana Trackman, called Praying with Lior, about Lior, a young man with Down syndrome. But people, rabbis and synagogues, cantors are saying, how do we do it? Please help us. I'm working right now with a very bright student who goes to a Jewish school in Manhattan, specializing in kids with language-based learning disabilities. Very smart, very bright, very inquisitive, and he's determined to learn the entire Torah portion of Emor. So in discussing his portion, the content, we're at a part where it talks about some disqualification criteria for a Kohen, for the priest serving in the Mishkan, in the portable temple. And it talks about a defect that would exclude a Kohen from service, including being blind or lame or having a limb too short, or a whole laundry list of other issues that make him disqualified. And this isn't really the only text in our tradition that suggests that certain people with disabilities should be disqualified. So this is sort of the flip side of those earlier texts that are very inclusive. But I want to quickly summarize a beautiful workaround of the rabbis of the Talmud, who also seem to come up with a way to help us deal with discomfort around disabilities. And this may surprise you. Essentially, the rabbis are talking about the priestly blessing, the Birkat Kohanim. Many of us do this to our children on Friday nights and say the priestly blessing. In Orthodox and maybe some conservative synagogues, we do this on holidays. In Israel, every single morning, they do Birkat Kohanim, the priestly blessing. But it says that if a Kohen, if a priest had some type of defect on his hands, and some said even if he had like some type of runny eye, it says he was not allowed to lift up his hands to recite the priestly blessing. So he essentially was disqualified. He was made ineligible. But here's the beautiful part. It says, the Gemara asks, wasn't there a certain priest with this condition in the neighborhood of Rav Huna, and he would spread his hands and recite the priestly blessing? The Gemara answers, that priest was Dash Be'irohi. He was a familiar figure in his town. Since other residents were accustomed to seeing him, he would not draw their attention during the priestly benediction. And it turns out the Talmud brings three similar cases of local rabbis who were aware of the rule, but they overruled it because they said, we know him. They didn't say, this is the Down syndrome guy or the autistic guy. They said, this is Yossi. This is Yonatan. We know him. We know him. I think this Talmud text is profound. It's profound because it's reminding us that the way to get comfortable with something or someone is via inclusion and normalization, not exclusion. So the more disabled people, the more people with disabilities are part of our communities, the more those communities get comfortable with the person and with the disability. So it's profound because it says it's the responsibility of non-disabled Jews to overcome their discomfort and to get to know the person and to build accessible communities where we can benefit from everybody's wisdom and contribution. So a couple of questions to think about. What are some ways to get to the point where people with disabilities and mental health conditions are familiar in this town, to use the words of the Talmud text? And what might such an inclusive community where sacred connections are the norm look like? Are there model communities which currently exist? And as you're thinking about it, I want to really conclude the entire presentation with sharing with you the story of building an intentional sacred community. And it's the one that I'm most familiar with because it personally changed my life. Because in 1984, I showed up at Camp Ramah in New England to work in the kitchen, and I was rerouted to what's called the Tikva program. So in the late 1960s, two Jewish special educators who didn't seem to have any personal connection through family to disabilities, they had an idea. Herb and Barbara Greenberg wanted to include people with disabilities in a typical Jewish overnight camp. And as you may imagine, this is the late 1960s. The Vietnam War was going on. People were talking about civil rights, peace, love. They weren't thinking about disabilities inclusion in Jewish summer camps. And the idea was rejected. Everybody, every camping movement, even within Camp Ramah, people said, this is a bad idea. The normal kids are going to leave. It's going to bankrupt the camp. The level of Hebrew will go down. It's going to ruin the structure of the camp. But in 1970, one director, Donnie Edelman of Camp Ramah in Glen Spey, New York, said yes. That's all it needed. The Tikva program was started. It was soon after relocated to Camp Ramah in New England. And that 1-year experiment turned into all of the camps of Camp Ramah, including people with disabilities. We have vocational training programs. We have Israel trips. We hire people for employment. This has become what we do at Ramah has become a model and the norm throughout the Jewish camping world. And again, I think that no camp director is going to say, sorry, we don't do disabilities. They may say, we're not the best for that type of disability, but call my colleague. So there are a lot of sacred communities of Jewish summer camp. Campers with disabilities swim and they dance and they go to drama, they put on plays, they go on camping trips, they lead Shabbat services in Birkat Hamazon. So obviously the program benefits campers with disabilities. Their families have an important respite. The kids grow and develop friendships, but it's really the typically developing kids in the camp who probably benefit just as much, if not more. They really appreciate the abilities of people with disabilities. Every camper, every staff member, every member of the Israeli delegation, the Mishlachat, for generations, for 60 or 70 years, has interacted meaningfully with people with disabilities. So in conclusion, what's beautiful is people with disabilities, both visible and invisible, are familiar figures in this town, meaning in Camp Ramah. The Tikva program benefits everybody. And my hope is, and my prayer is, that may this model of a sacred, inclusive community become the norm in our synagogues and in all parts of the Jewish world. Thank you very much.